All right, today we're going to be talking about the beginnings of elite sport in America. And these elite sports, they essentially came about so that the rich could keep themselves separate from the common folk, probably like most of us are. These are sports originally limited to the upper class, and today some of these sports are still very much limited to the upper class as far as both participating and observing, like yachting. I mean, there's not many of us who aren't in that upper class who really know a lot about yachting. But there are other sports where the participants may be elite, but observers, and we might be of other classes, can be observing the sport, like horse racing. That's become quite popular. A lot that has to do with the off-track betting and the fact that you don't have to be at a racetrack in order to do it. And still other of these elite sports that we'll talk about have moved from being strictly for the elite into people for all other economic levels, tennis and golf. Although it certainly still does help to have money, more and more people in not upper class are participating in these sports. So what we see happening is that sports help to create an American upper class. In the United States, we did not have, as far as our history goes, we did not have what they had in Europe, which was an hereditary aristocracy. In other words, there were people in Europe who were born into money, and they passed that money down to their kids, and they passed that money down to their kids, and they were the lords and ladies and so forth, and barons and that sort of thing. And so they always had a title, and they always were in the upper class. Here in the United States, people would work their way up to the upper class, and they might have their children might benefit from their money in future years, but still somebody actually built up to that. But one thing that was common between the upper class here and in Europe was that the upper class did try to separate themselves from the other classes. This might happen in places where they lived, where their children went to school, and in activities, which is where sports come into play. And so these private clubs started to be formed. They helped to create this upper class. And these private clubs really started to increase in number and activity after the Civil War. Obviously, people were pretty busy during the Civil War. They were concerned with other things during that time. It was after that, the Civil War, when things settled down and people could start to actually think about their wealth and do specific activities with it. And what you see happening with these private clubs and with the upper class is that, as we talked about in previous chapters, the upper class tried to emulate the Europeans, doing the same activities that they did in the same ways, and this included more participation in more sports by the mid-19th century. So we see sports like, in Europe, sports like cricket, yachting, track and field, rowing, cycling, lawn tennis, and then later golf coming into play. And the Americans, I'd say the Europeans doing these things, and so the American upper class started to want to do them as well. One of the big places for sporting events was in New York. Boston and Philadelphia, they were also had wealthy communities, but their rich tended to dominate in all areas of life. So in industrial areas, in fashion, in culture, and so forth, one set of people tended to do that. Whereas in New York City, it was what we call a more fractured elite. So there were elite people in trade, there were elite people in politics. They might be separate people who kind of led the culture, fashion, and so you see a broader spectrum of people in New York. And many of these people, even more so than in Boston and Philadelphia, they were people who more recently became wealthy. And when they became wealthy, they wanted to show off their wealth through expensive sports. One of those sports was yachting. And this one in particular helped to strengthen the bonds between the Americans and the British sportsmen because they started to do some competitions. In 1844, now these dates, I don't know if I mentioned this before, dates, you don't necessarily need to know exact dates, but just know in the mid-18th and mid-19th century, 19th century means the 1800s, so in the mid-1800s is when you start to see yachting become popular. So we see the New York Yacht Club formed by John Cox Stevens, and that was just one of the first, it was one of the first elite clubs that we see. So it was pretty early. That was even before the Civil War happening. And in fact, in 1851, there was a race with the British that the yacht called America actually won. And whoops, here is a picture of that yacht that won the first international race. And now, of course, we have the America's Cup. And this was kind of the start of that. James Gordon Bennett Jr., he was the owner of the New York Herald. He was influential in influencing several sports, which included yachting, and he was the one who won that first transatlantic yacht race in 1866. He is also famous, as your quiz talked about. He was famous for sponsoring some money to search for David Livingstone, an explorer who was lost in Africa. And you may have heard of the story of the searchers when they came. They actually did find David Livingstone, and when they came upon him, the gentleman reportedly said, "Livingstone, I presume?" And James Gordon Bennett was the one who sponsored that search, and he used that search to his advantage by publishing reports about it in his newspaper, which kept people enthralled. And of course, he also did this with the sporting events, like reporting the yachting and track and field events, polo and tennis. Bennett was the one who introduced polo to the United States. He also started, as your book mentioned, giving awards and cups to track and field champions, and he even began and built an elite athletic club called the Casino, which hosted the first tennis championships. He built that club when he was kicked out of another club for some bet about betting somebody that they couldn't race their horse up the steps of the club, and that got him kicked out of the club. So he built his own club. Had enough money where he could do that, and he ended up sponsoring the first several American tennis championships there. And again, we see the American yacht there. So yachting was a big elite sport during that time, and still is today. However, thoroughbred racing got its start back then as well, and that has continued, probably even more popular today, as we mentioned before, because it has gone to the so-called middle class and lower classes as far as observing, anyway. Antebellum means before the Civil War, and so antebellum racing wasn't consistently prosperous. So the wealthy people didn't do much with it because it didn't help make them money and didn't show off their money as well. But starting in the 1860s, millionaires started to build up horse racing by doing several things. They built new tracks, creating tracks that would be permanent places for races to take place, and we'll look at some of those in just a second. They started providing and creating these large stakes. So, today we have the Kentucky Derby, which has huge purses that go with it, prize money. They reduced the corruption that went in with it as far as fixing races and that sort of thing. They started substituting shorter races, what they called dashes, for 3 to 4 mile races. So the original races during antebellum time were these long kind of endurance 3 to 4 mile races, which aren't good for observation and being a fan. So they reduced them to the shorter races, a mile and a quarter, a mile and a half, mile and 3/16, those things, so that they could actually have a place where you had a circle and you could see the event happening from one spot. And that got started during this time. They also barred the sale of alcohol and tried to build it up that way. Now, one of the main leaders of the thoroughbred racing movement was a man by the name of Leonard Jerome. He built a place called Jerome Park in the Bronx, which is the first home of the Belmont Stakes. Leonard Jerome ended up being the grandfather of Winston Churchill, who was a famous prime minister of Great Britain. He was prime minister during World War II. And move ahead here a little bit. There's a picture, a drawing of Jerome Horse Park. You can see it was quite the building at this time for back then. And Leonard Jerome helped to establish with 2 other of his friends the American Jockey Club. And they ended up, as we said before, they replaced those 3 to 4 mile races. They created these large permanent stakes with races, particular races. The Jockey Club was in charge of appointing officials, licensing jockeys. So you had to have certain people could be jockeys and certain people could not. They provided uniform national rules, set national racing dates, so there wasn't competition between major races like the Kentucky Derby and the Belmont Stakes couldn't be held on the same day. So they made sure of that. And so they gave horse racing a continuity and something that would help it to develop. Unfortunately, though, it was still outside of Victorian acceptability, mostly because of the gambling that went on. They tried at first to ban the sale of alcohol and have no gambling, but gambling went on nonetheless. It did, however, start developing, and we're going to take a look at some of the more famous races that got its start back during this time. One, we look at the Triple Crown, got its development during this time, late 1800s. Kentucky Derby is one leg of the Triple Crown, if you're familiar with that. That is held in Churchill Downs in Louisville. It's 1.25 miles long, so very different than the 3 to 4 mile races that they used to have. Run for the roses, they say, at the Kentucky Derby. It was established back in 1875, so it has quite a long history. It's a beautiful place. People of Louisville are very proud of their Kentucky Derby. Actually, I know some professors at the University of Louisville, and their sport management students, undergrad and graduate, do quite a lot of work with the Kentucky Derby, helping to get it ready and during the race. Another part of the Triple Crown, the second leg, is the Preakness Stakes. There you see an early picture of that. That's held in Pimlico, Baltimore, and it is a 1.5 and 3/16 long. So it's a little bit shorter. This is the shortest leg of the Triple Crown. And it was established back in 1873. The third leg, final leg of the Triple Crown, is the Belmont Stakes. It is the longest race held in Belmont Park, New York. It's a 1.5 mile race. It was established back in 1867. Again, another beautiful place. I think these are the Black-Eyed Susans, are there? Flower. Don't quote me on that, but it's either that or the Pimlico. Can't remember. But throughout the years, it is quite a prestigious thing for horses to win the Triple Crown, to win all three of these major races, which got their start during this time. And here's a list of Triple Crown winners. So from at the top left, we see Sir Barton, I think back in 1919, Gallant Fox in 1930. I can't read that next one. War Admiral was in 1937. That's the fourth one from the left. Whirl Away in 1941. Count Fleet in 1943. Second row, first one, Assault, 1946. Citation, 1948. Then there was a huge gap in time. The next Triple Crown winner was Secretariat in 1973, probably the greatest racer of all time. And in fact, a Secretariat was named one of the top, I think, 25 athletes of the second half of the 20th century. Just an amazing horse. We're going to see a little bit about Secretariat in just a little bit. Seattle Slew followed Secretariat in 1977. Affirmed was in 1979, I believe that is. And then not another one until American Pharoah in 2015. But we also saw just very recently in 2018, Justify won the Triple Crown. So his face can be added to this list of Triple Crown winners. Now, obviously all of them are great horses. Secretariat is probably one of the most fantastic horses to ever race. He had an extremely long stride, and it's a beautiful, beautiful horse. He won. We're going to show a clip from a movie. It was a movie about Secretariat back in 1972 that shows just how great of a horse he was. I mean, horses they win by a nose, they might win by a length, 2 lengths, whatever. You're going to see just how absolutely fantastic this horse was. Stop just for a second. This is the 3rd leg of the Triple Crown. This is where we see Secretariat. He's already won the first 2 legs, and he's trying to win the last leg. And so you're going to see how he does it. Again, just an incredible feat.
He laughs at fear, afraid of nothing. He does not shy away from the sword. He cannot stand still when the trumpet sounds. she knew that there was...
So that's how Secretariat won the third leg of the Triple Crown by 31 lengths. I get chills every time I see it. They have a statue of him at Kentucky Park in Louisville, and one of the things they found was that his stride was so much longer than any other horse's stride. It was just incredible. But then also after he died, they did an autopsy and found that his heart was 2.5 times larger than other horses of his same caliber. So like the horse who got second in that race, which you couldn't even see in the picture, his heart was 2.5 times larger, which obviously you're in exercise and exercise science, you know that contributes a lot to a person's ability to perform, as well as a horse's. Now, this is an elite sport because these horses cost a lot of money. You and I, there would have to be hundreds of us go together to be able to afford a good, great racing horse like this. But Secretariat was probably the best horse of all time, and that's something that's pretty incredible. The story behind Secretariat, who his owner, Penny Charney, called Big Red, is pretty incredible too. With the trainer, he was in retirement and she pulled him out, and the horse farm where he was sired, it was supposed to go under. It was Penny Charney's father's. Just a wonderful story in all, and just an absolute great thing. But we get to enjoy it today. Back then, it was pretty strictly an elite person's sport. Now, athletic clubs got their start during this time, the late 1800s. The New York Athletic Club was probably the most prominent, was the first one and the most prominent one. It was formed in 1866. 3 wealthy athletes got together. They wanted a place to compete, a place to do track and field, and with people of their same social standing, and had the same kind of interests. And so they formed their club, modeled it after British clubs at that time. Other clubs around the country soon opened after the New York one and followed their model. Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia, places like that. In order to belong to the club, you had to apply in writing. You had to have the support of some current members. So you couldn't not anybody could just go in. Plus, you had to pay a fee of anywhere from $50 to $100, which is a pretty extravagant fee for back then. So just not anybody could belong. The New York Athletic Club, it is still around today. It sponsors many track events particularly, and it was particularly back then, they were quite innovative. They had the first cinder track, and first to come up with spiked shoes to help one run. But they also sponsored the first national championships in things like track and field, swimming, boxing, and even wrestling. So, they had a lot to do with several different sports. The New York Athletic Club helped to form the Amateur Athletic Union, the AAU, in 1888. Which then took control of U.S. track and field and upheld this amateurism. And we'll talk about that in just a second. The New York Athletic Club served as gatekeeper for entrance into other clubs. So, as we talked about, other athletic clubs modeled after it in other cities, but then, if you wanted to get into other kinds of, like the tennis club or other things like that, you might have to be a member of the New York Athletic Club in order to do that. So it wasn't just sports, but it was also very social events, so dances and dinners and those sorts of things. Galas took place with these clubs. The 1880s and the 1890s were the peak of athletic clubs, but they started to decline with an economic depression in the later 1890s. Again, the New York Athletic Club is still around today. Google it and you'll find some things, various things about the club and what they're doing. Very prominent during this time and very much promoted by these athletic clubs was the concept of amateurism. And this was the principle of the American upper class when it came to sporting events. So amateurism at this time, one of the things it involved was that you had to play without pay, or pay without play. No, you played without pay. So you couldn't get paid for playing. No professionalism. And that was one of the things, if you wanted to belong to an athletic club, you had to be an amateur. You were playing for the fun of it. And you had to play in a special way, having to do with fairness and no need for officials. So the idea of if you were playing tennis or whatever case was, if there was some kind of foul or something, or the ball was out, you called it out. There was no officials for you to have it called. You didn't try to get by with things. You played in a way that emphasized the fairness because you wanted to win fair and square. And the fourth one here is very important. The idea that the greatest applause were for athletes with the highest skill, but with little training or effort. So the idea that you should not, your athleticism should come naturally. You don't have to work to get it. Working to get it was more of a working class ideal. The idea is we're rich. We don't have to work for things. If you've ever seen the movie Chariots of Fire, it's a story of two athletes in Ireland and Great Britain, and they end up running for Great Britain, but the one athlete in particular, he's a Jewish man, and so that gives there is some prejudice against him for that back then. But he actually has a trainer that helps him to train. And this is in the 1920s. And the people at his school look down upon that. They just think that's the worst thing because he shouldn't have to train. He should be able to do well without training. And so that's one of these things that was very, it carried through for a long time. This idea of amateurism was built on the myth of ancient Greek amateurism. The idea that back in ancient Greek times, the athletes that competed in the first Olympic Games, the myth put forth by the rich folks at this time was that they didn't get paid for anything. which is absolutely not true. The ancient Greek athletes were not amateurs. They were paid huge sums for winning their Olympics and their other type games. They had all these different types of games that were going on. And yes, they got a laurel wreath for winning, but if you won something at one of their Olympic Games, you were set for life. You didn't have to ever pay for anything ever again. Whatever the event was, whatever, you were set. And they actually did train too. They had training camps for people who are the men who are getting ready for the Olympic Games. So this idea of promoting amateurism as coming from the Greeks is absolutely not true. That is a myth. And so the rich just made this up so that they could try to keep themselves separate from the rest of society. Okay, so uses of amateurism, yes, social exclusion. It excluded people who were not rich. Lower class men, they would use their skill in sport to make money. Whether they were boxers, if they were runners, whatever the case was, they would participate and try to win a race, and the race would have a prize. And so, or win a fight, and that would have a prize. And so that was one way to keep them out. Oh, you won money for racing? Nope, you can't belong to our club. So it kept out the lower class in that way. The lower class, if you were a lower class man and you wanted to participate in sport, you had to take money, because otherwise, you weren't going to make money otherwise. If you were trying to keep a job down and participate in your sport, it wasn't happening. So you weren't going to be very good at your sport. So they had to take money in order to survive. And so they could not belong to these clubs because of it. The lower class also couldn't afford the club membership to learn about sports. So let's say somebody of a lower class was interested in cricket or tennis. They couldn't afford to do it because they couldn't afford the $50 or $100 to join those clubs. That was an enormous sum of money at that time. That might have been several years' wages for them. So there was no way they were going to be able to afford membership. So we have this distinct upper class community developing in sport, keeping the lower class out. But at the same time, the rich people wanted to win. And so they might subsidize a lower class talented man so they could join a club. The example given in the book was Lon Myers. He was a Jewish lower class man who could run very fast. Well, they had some, I forget which athletic club it was, some of the men of that club, they sponsored him so that they wrote the letters so that he could get into the club, and they also foot the money so that he could join the club. And then Lon Myers would run for their club and show, oh, look, our club is great because Lon Myers is in our club and he won the race. So yeah, they tried to keep their amateurism, but they found their ways around it to their own advantage. One thing that became very popular during this time was cricket. And so several cricket clubs developed in the United States. It was especially popular in Philadelphia, and cricket was a sport that was played a lot in Great Britain. We have a cricket club, I believe, here on campus, and we had some one year during our summer camp, we had some of the players come and show our campers how to play cricket. I don't think our campers enjoyed it very much, but they got to see it anyway. We managed to have success in international play, so people in American cricket clubs, they would play against people in European clubs. And now you can see how this would be more of a rich person's thing, because how are you going to get over to play in these overseas, to play in these tournaments, unless you're rich? They were the ones who could do it. And it was a status symbol to be in the cricket club because, number one, it took money. It took time to play. And it emulated the British rich. If you're not familiar with cricket, it has some similarities to baseball. It's probably where we got some of our baseball ideas. But in the early 20th century, so the early 1900s, the sport of cricket started to decline and give way to other sports in the club, like tennis. So these cricket clubs, fewer and fewer people were interested in cricket, and more of them started to become interested in tennis. And so we started to see more and more tennis played in these clubs. And that's how you start to see tennis becoming a rich person's sport. Bill Tilden was a famous 1920s tennis champion, and he actually learned tennis in a place called the Germantown Cricket Club. And here we see a picture of Bill Tilden on the left, who competed against people from Europe. And a drawing of the Germantown Cricket Club to the right. Now, a word about the country clubs. The country clubs in Britain were different. In Great Britain, the wealthy lived in the country, so they had their country homes. And so they went into the cities to go to their clubs. Whereas in the United States, the wealthy lived in the cities because that's where their factories were and how they made their money and stuff, and could run all their businesses. But then they belonged to clubs in the country, hence the country club. And they were country clubs that were trying to emulate these English country homes, showing that they were elite because they had these clubs in the country. The original beginnings of what was going on in these clubs, things like hunting, fishing, and horseback riding, eventually changing to things like tennis and golf, as we'll see. The first one to call itself a country club was Boston's Brookline Country Club. And as we've been talking about, it was a socially exclusive place. Again, if you couldn't afford the membership fee, or you couldn't get somebody to say, hey, this person belongs here, you weren't let in. Now, how did golf become associated with country clubs? These two gentlemen, John M. Fox and John Reed, first introduced golf to the United States. And if you look around Lambert, you will see some early pictures of golf going on. Looks a little bit like what we see today, but you can see some differences too. The first golf club was established back in 1887, so it was pretty early. But it wasn't until the 1890s that it started to catch on with the wealthy. And they started to create these elaborate golf courses with the artificial sand traps, water hazards, and so forth. So it wasn't just a natural setting anymore. They started to create these kinds of things. And again, who can create their own sand traps and water hazards and things? The wealthy, because they can afford to pay for those sorts of things. By the 1900s, we see resorts, so places where the wealthy from the north would go during the winter months to stay warm. They started to have golf available in the south. And so now, people in the winter here, they will take their golf clubs during the winter and go south and play golf. Several of our people here in the department I know who do that. And this was kind of different. The wealthy enjoyed playing for pleasure. And this was unlike the typical Victorian value that play should aid work. So we're moving away from that Victorian value that if you're playing, it should be helping your work. No, these wealthy started to believe that, hey, you know what, I'm just going to play golf because I like it. It's not going to help me with my physical stamina at all. It's not going to help my work at all. I'm just going to play it because I like it. And that was a different thing that developed during this time. So this gives you some idea of some of the elite sports that went on and how they got their start here in the United States. And again, you can see ones that have gone on to be available and actually played by people of all different economic statuses, but maybe not. I mean, we could argue whether or not things like tennis and golf are available to people of all economic statuses. Things like yachting that many people don't hear much about or participate in, for sure. And things like horse racing that many people enjoy, but certainly don't have the money to actually own a horse.